we realize that there's so much to discuss, particularly related to advocacy, diversity, equity, inclusion, and especially health equity. Today is the result, and you're going to hear from some of the most accomplished and active advocates and mentors that we have in our chapters as they share their experiences and wisdom. We're so pleased that attendees from all around the country are joining us in this discussion today, particularly as Leadership Day is next week. So I'd like to start us off with some brief housekeeping announcements. Please keep yourselves muted during this event. The chat is live and we welcome questions at any time, so don't be shy about typing them into the chat. We completely welcome a variety of perspectives and we look forward to a collegial and respectful discussion. Please be aware that we're recording this event to share later, and photographs may be taken for the event for promotional purposes. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce the always inspiring Governor Vidya Sundaresan from the Illinois chapter. Vidya.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. This event is proudly co-sponsored by 5 ACP chapters: California, Southern Region 3, Illinois, Oregon, New York, and Texas. We'd like to acknowledge the work of the planning committee that includes Dr. Roger Ketan, Governor from Texas, Susan Lee, Governor from Texas, Tammy Lynn, Governor from California, Jenny Silberger, Governor from Oregon, Marianne Parsley, immediate past governor and ACP regent from Oregon, Vidya Sundaresan, governor from Illinois, Nicole Abbott, executive director from Texas, Heather Bennett, executive director from New York, Colleen Kiku, executive director from Illinois, Mary Olhausen, executive director from Oregon, Teresa Roth, executive director from California. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jenny Silberger, Governor from Oregon, to read our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Vidya. Good morning, everyone. We acknowledge and honor the land that provides a home to the communities coming together today. We are gathered virtually, but hosted in partnership from ACP chapters representing Southern California, Illinois, Oregon, New York, and Texas. We acknowledge that we are on the stolen traditional lands of Indigenous peoples, and we acknowledge the numerous tribal communities to honor their connection to these lands and their continued presence among us. Now I'd like to introduce Governor Susan Lee from the New York chapter to read a statement about diversity and inclusion.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. The 5 sponsoring ACP chapters of the American College of Physicians have committed to diversity and inclusion. The commitment to diversity in the profession promotes new ways of thinking, brings diversity of ideas to patient care and public health, and fosters the ability to connect, build, and strengthen relationships. Improving care for all patients and all communities is the goal. We recognize the history of racism in both the profession of medicine as well as in all of our states, and together we are working towards eliminating racism within our profession and broader community. With that in mind, we welcome our attendees to this event and encourage you all to join us in welcoming the diversity represented here today. And we want to remind all of you that you all belong here. With that, I will let Dr. Roger Ketan from the great state of Texas introduce our moderator, Dr. Omar Atiq.
As you will probably see in a few minutes, Dr. Atiq's credentials are going to appear on the screen, but he is amazing. He's currently the professor of medicine, otolaryngology, head and neck surgery at the University of Arkansas of Medical Sciences in Little Rock, Arkansas. He's the president-elect for our national ACP and is the immediate past chair of our Health and Public Policy Committee. He's a member of our Global Engagement Committee, as well as our member of the Board of Regents. We are very fortunate to have him expertly mentor and moderate our session today. Before we turn it to Dr. Atiq for the rest of the session, I also we as a group want to do a special tribute to one of our most well-respected and accomplished advocates in Washington, DC, or anywhere. He has 43 years of experience of advocating for the American College of Physicians. His name's Bob Doherty, Senior Vice President Emeritus and Special Advisor to the Chief Advocacy Officer of the American College of Physicians. And it's an honor to have our current Board of Regents Chair and Master Advocate herself, Dr. Sue Bornstein, with us to say a few words about Bob. Dr. Bornstein, as some of you may know, has been with the ACP a very long time. I think combined, we may have over 75 years of experience here. And Dr. Bornstein works on the Texas Patient Medical Home, but she was a practicing internist and a very dear friend to all of us here at the ACP. Dr. Bornstein.
Thank you, Dr. Caton, Dr. Lynn, and the rest of the planning committee. Thank you for asking me to do something that makes me feel good. So it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to celebrate Bob Doherty and his illustrious and lengthy career at the American College of Physicians. Bob has been a passionate student of healthcare policy since his undergrad days at American University. Bob went to work for the American Society of Internal Medicine out of college and really never looked back. He was instrumental in the merger of the American Society of Internal Medicine and ACP in 1998. I think we can all agree that Bob's knowledge of healthcare policy is truly encyclopedic. He's been the driving force in countless ACP policy initiatives, including the passage of the Affordable Care Act and the repeal of the Sustainable Growth Rate. Now, I've been involved in policy development at ACP for about 10 years, and in that relatively short period of time, so you figure that's about a quarter of Bob's tenure, here are some of the major, and I only say the major policy issues Bob has spearheaded for the college: climate change, LGBTQ health equity, gender pay equity, women's health, prevention and treatment of substance use disorder, addressing social determinants of health, reducing firearm injury and death, reducing prescription drug prices, strengthening behavioral health services in the new vision papers, and declaring ACP to be an anti-racist organization. And again, that is really a small fraction of what he has done. And if you notice, there is a theme that runs through these, and that is equity. I don't think you could really look at any of these policies and say that there's not an equity focus. Bob is a proud son of Irish immigrants to the US and speaks fondly of his youth in Woodside, Queens, New York, where he worked along his father at Doherty's bar. And during those days, those years, Bob also saw firsthand the discrimination that the Irish and other immigrant groups experienced. I don't think there's any doubt that these early experiences helped fuel his passion for lifting up the disenfranchised. And this passion is evident in everything Bob does. He exhorts us to think how every policy we develop will affect those less fortunate in our society. And his sense of justice and fairness is unerring. And all of us that know Bob know that Bob lives life on a big scale. He is a big personality with a deep baritone voice, and we know when he's in the room. Bob loves to travel and spend time with his beloved family, his wife, Liz, his daughters, Kara and Caitlin, his son, Brendan, his mom, and his sisters. And did I mention that Bob loves baseball? Oh, yes. Bob is a lifelong Mets fan, which you know means perpetual heartbreak, but he also loves the Washington Nats. He loves hockey too. The Capitals are a favorite. And in keeping with his Irish heritage, Bob does love a good limerick and a good beer. And I think St. Patrick's is probably his favorite holiday. And maybe because he's so devoted to sports, Bob is a great team player. He has served under 4 ACP CEOs. And throughout the years, he has mentored many young people in the Division of Government Affairs and Public Policy. And all would hold Bob in very high regard. In 2015, on the occasion of the ACP Centennial, Dr. Charles Bryant wrote an article in The Lancet celebrating internal medicine and ACP. He wrote, "In many ways, internal medicine has served as the conscience for the medical profession at large." And I would submit to you that ACP then is the conscience of American healthcare. And Bob has had a very significant role. Bob is a prolific writer, most of you know. In one of his blog posts, he wrote, "ACP advocacy and physician advocacy is about the art and science of guiding or influencing government policy for the betterment of patients, physicians, and the public. It is not about engaging in partisan politics. Rather, we seek to guide and influence public policy for the benefit of patients, the public, and the medical profession without regard to the partisan affiliation of the stakeholder office holder." And when people suggest, which they do frequently, that ACP should, quote, stay out of politics, unquote, Bob responds that if we stay out of politics in policy discussions, we deprive ourselves of the ability to influence policy to benefit our patients and our profession. And in the same blog post, Bob quotes the Greek philosopher Pericles. What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but what is woven into the lives of others. Bob concludes by saying, by engaging in advocacy through the political process, ACP hopes to leave behind a legacy of making others' lives better. This, Bob Doherty, is your legacy. To quote the musical Wicked, because we knew you, we have been changed for good. Thank you and Godspeed.
Well, thank you, Sue and Roger, for the very kind introduction and for honoring me. As you know, it's hard for me to believe my retirement is less than 3 months from now. I will have to say I am a big sports fan. I'm a big Washington Capitals fan. I was at the game last night where we got eliminated in the first round of the playoffs. So I'm still processing that right now. But I do want to make a few remarks about my legacy and what I have learned and gained from ACP and what we have all accomplished together. And some of my comments, the Board of Governors and Board of Regents heard a few weeks ago, I am internal medicine 2022, but I do want to reprise some of them. ACP is a place where I've been able to act on my passion for social justice and equity. Among our shared achievements that I'm most proud of is the Affordable Care Act, which Sue mentioned. People I don't think really understand the impact that has happened. It extended coverage to millions and millions of people, tried to protect patient protections for almost all of us, and is just having record enrollment right now. I am proud of our leadership in advocating for fair and compassionate immigration policies, being the son of an Irish immigrant. I'm very proud of what we accomplished together in putting forward our new vision for healthcare in early 2020, which was so prescient, I think, in identifying the problems in the U.S. healthcare and what we need to do better, things that we have seen a focus on during the pandemic. I'm proud of our commitment to challenging the existential threat of climate change, our courage in taking on the epidemic of gun violence and the NRA that enables it, and our pledge to stand for diversity, equity, anti-racism, and inclusion, especially our recent policy framework for challenging and overcoming racial and ethnic discrimination and disparities in care. I do want to talk, though, about not just the past, but our present and future. I believe we are living in times that will decide if better health care for all is a hollow slogan or a sacred commitment to be honored not just by words, but by action. We are seeing states enact hateful laws to target transgender persons, ban or limit discussion of gender identity and sexual orientation in schools. Heard discussions about the systemic racism that is both our history and our abiding present, criminalizing reproductive and transgender care, and a Supreme Court that appeals poised to overturn a woman's constitutional right to abortion and ban affirmative action. In my mind, there is nothing that screams big government more than when states dictate to patients, families, and their physicians what health care they will allow. Patient-physician relationship is also threatened by the commercialization, corporatization, and consolidation of healthcare. Everybody talks about healthcare, and you see ads all the time promising that we deliver better healthcare, we deliver healthcare. How much do we really care? We really care about our most bullied and marginalized neighbors, like the high-risk transgender teenager who cannot get the treatments they need while the schools cannot even acknowledge their existence. We really care that corporations are putting profit over health. We really care about the rising toll of gun violence. We really care about a woman who has to make a difficult choice after conceiving a pregnancy while the government does all it can to impose its will on her. We care about people from other countries seeking a better life in the U.S. who face mistreatment and discrimination. I'd say too many of us don't care. For those of us who do care, and I believe all of you care, you would not be on this program right now if you didn't care. I have to ask, and I ask this myself, do we care enough to take the risk needed to truly center the bullies, hate mongers, and demagogues look to climb to greater heights of power and wealth by trampling the most vulnerable among us? When earlier generations were asked, did you do enough to stand up to Jim Crow laws? Many did not have a satisfying answer. we too will be asked if we cared enough to stand up against today's hateful laws. So I commend you for this program today on advancing health equity. The more that health equity is at risk, the greater the need to advocate for health equity. I am aware this carries risks to all of you and those of you who are leaders in your state. You will risk losing members who mistake principled advocacy for what is right, which ACP proudly does, partisan advocacy to help a political party, which we never do. Yet I believe more members will be proud that ACP is taking a principled stand. You will antagonize powerful public officials in your states, who, even though you may need their support on other issues. You will be told to stay in your lane. Remember when the NRA famously told us to stay in our lane, and that caused a whole "this is our lane" movement? Consider this: if you're driving down a highway where there is no speed limit, no laws against impaired driving, no guardrails, and a car with no required seatbelts or airbags, would you be safe just staying in your own lane? Of course you wouldn't. You would insist on laws and standards to keep everyone safe. The same is true of health. Our lane is advocacy, good health and good health care for all, and the policies needed to achieve it. But I know that ACP National will be supporting all of you in the states in dealing with these challenges. I just want to quote from Abraham Lincoln, which I also mentioned in my talk to the Board of Regents and Board of Governors. Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, said, "The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave, to every living heart and hearthstone all over this land, will yet well swell the chorus of the Union. When again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." For all of my concern about today and tomorrow, I believe this country can again be touched by the better angels of our nature. ACP is a place where you all, as leaders and members, and as specialists in internal medicine, can help our country be touched again by better angels. I want to say in closing that I am very happy that Sherry Erickson, I think many of you know her. If you don't, you will. She is the new Senior Vice President of Governmental Affairs and Public Policy, Chief Advocacy Officer. My role is transitioned to being her Chief Advisor. And there's so much I can tell you about Sherry. And those of you coming to Leadership Day will be hearing from both Sherry and me, but about her wisdom, her determination, her creativity, and the respect she engenders from all. The one thing I want you to know more than anything else about Sherry, she's a deeply caring person, and there's no one better to lead ACP in these uncaring times. So let me end by saying thank you for 43 years of achievement, of friendship, and yes, of some fun. And those who are going to the AMA meeting, we'll still have a little time for a little more fun. I will miss you more than I can put into words. It's time now for me to spend more time with my friends and family, to hike, to read, more for pleasure, to travel, even relax. I'll be around for a few more months, offering my support and advice to Sherry. I will leave with a heavy heart for what I will miss, but uplifted by what lies ahead for me and for ACP. And again, thank you very much for your heartfelt tribute. It means so much to me.
Round of applause.
Good morning. I am Omar Atiq, President-elect of ACP, and your moderator today. Bob Doherty is a legend. He has done his job well, and the world is better because of it. Thank you, Bob. Couldn't add a whole lot more to what Sue Bornstein has already said about you and about your services, but thank you. This morning, I am honored to join the architects and the participants of this enormously important ACP chapter event organized by California, Texas, Oregon, Illinois, and New York, under the leadership of Dr. Tammy Lynn, emphasizing diversity, equity, inclusion, and the urgent need to raise our voice for justice and fairness until all get a fair shake. And everyone, I mean everyone, is accepted as an equal partner on this table of life, without any exception. Of course, we as American physicians should start demanding and working towards that goal of equity and justice in our own backyard first. We acknowledge past injustices, as has been mentioned earlier, and the unfortunate discrimination in health and healthcare, and its long-term consequences on our fellow Americans. We must start to rectify the fallout from the racist and discriminatory laws and policies that have led to just terrible human suffering. into the inhuman and unacceptable gaps of longevity, quality of life, and other important health parameters between Americans of European descent and African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and others. Now, this is not to ignore the individual suffering of many in the majority, rather to rearrange the table where all suffering is removed. Towards that end, our ACP policy statement published in the Annals in June of 2020 not only condemns the injustices and discrimination under any circumstances, but it commits ACP to being an anti-racist organization dedicated to action and policy to confront and eliminate racism and discrimination. ACP reaffirms hate crimes as a public health issue and prioritizes elimination of discrimination in law enforcement. Then our comprehensive policy framework to understand and address disparities and discrimination in health and healthcare, published in the Annals in January of 2021, goes in great detail about health and healthcare disparities, which result, of course, as we all know, from a complex set of factors, including social, economic, educational, environmental, biologic, and the ever-present unfortunate discrimination embedded in the system at numerous levels. This policy framework recognizes and confronts the many elements of our society, some of which are intertwined and compounding, that contribute to poor health outcomes. In addition to this framework, which includes high-level principles and discusses how disparities are interconnected, ACP offers specific policy recommendations on disparities and discrimination affecting specific populations at the greatest risk, the ones that I have alluded to earlier. And then the discrimination in education and the workforce, and those in criminal justice practices and policies. And of course, we do that in 3 companion policy papers. Bob had a lot to do with it. He was really the force behind these policy papers. The ACP, of course, along with the governance, ACP believes that a cross-cutting approach that identifies and offers solutions to the various aspects of society contributing to poor health is essential to achieving its goal of good healthcare for all and poor healthcare for none. I must mention that in that ACP policy paper, 3 of the 17 overarching recommendations relate directly to all of us today here as physicians. It asks us to acknowledge and address implicit bias towards patients different from us. And I use the word different in the widest and the broadest sense possible. It's to acknowledge and address the implicit bias towards patients different from us, lays emphasis on being patient-focused and culturally appropriate to create a trusted system. That's our job. And to create a welcoming atmosphere for our minority colleagues. And in some instances, those minority colleagues may be from what is considered majority. So the bottom line is, we have to be cognizant, intentional, and non-discriminatory in all situations, all the time. We really have to model the truth we seek others to emulate. So at this point, I am going to go over the program quickly with you. As you all know from the agenda, we have a keynote address, which would last about 15 minutes. Then we have a panel discussion where each of the 5 panelists would have 8 minutes to give their views. And following that, the entire time would be for questions and answers. One thing that I would like to emphasize to all the participants is this. This is safe space. There will be no judgment, just curiosity and camaraderie. So moving on to the keynote speaker, Dr. David Hilden. David received his MD from University of Minnesota Medical School in Minneapolis. He completed internal medicine residency at the Hahnemann County Medical Center in Minneapolis as well, and received his MPH from the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. Dr. Hilden is a professor of medicine at the University of Minnesota Medical School and staff physician at the Hahnemann Healthcare System. Additionally, he serves as the ACP, as Vice Chair of the Health and Public Policy Committee, and had a lot to do with the papers that I alluded to earlier during his previous term. He's governor of the Minnesota ACP chapter. He is going to talk about impact of words. What is equity? Why it matters? And how can it be addressed in advocacy? David?
Thank you, Dr. Atiq. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I want to just say that it's been a treat for me, a privilege, in fact, to get to know Dr. Atiq working on the National HPPC meeting. He is truly a gem of an internist and an inspiration to me. So Omar, thank you for that. I want to thank the Planning Committee, the 5 governors from Illinois, Southern California, Texas, New York, and Oregon for inviting me here today, and to the executive directors of those chapters who have done such a fantastic job putting this meeting together. I've been asked to talk about the intersection of advocacy and equity. And so I'm going to do that under the rubric of the impact of words. Next slide, please. We can go to the next slide. Think of these 3 words, if you will, my friends. Think of ally, intention, belonging. Pause for a moment. What do those words mean to you? Ally, intention, belonging. I hope to get you to think about health equity using these 3 words, but it's more than just words. I want to put some meat on this bone. I would like to try to use these words and maybe get you to think about equity, about justice in some new ways. Ally, intention, belonging. Next slide. So this is a legitimate question. Why is a white guy giving this talk? Why am I here? Why, I've asked this question myself, and I think you might be asking that question. Why am I giving this talk? Here's the thing. Back to the first word, allyship. I think often, what does it mean for those of us who are in the role of an ally? Because being an ally means doing the hard work. This is why it matters to those of us who live with privilege in your life. I am not an expert on diversity. I do not have the lived experience of many, many of my friends and colleagues and co-inhabitants of this planet. I come from a place of privilege. So what I would like to do is give you that perspective. It's a personal perspective. It is not from a place of expertise. Next slide. After all, I'm not a racist, am I? I'm not a racist. How many times have you heard that phrase? I am not a racist is something that I think we need to get beyond. Because am I? Am I a racist? Or have I simply not noticed that I have been swimming in a sea of racism my whole life and not noticed? This is far more about what is, it means so much more than what is in your heart. This is so much more about overt acts of racism. Those are awful and need to be condemned wherever we see them. True, but it is so much more about that. What we need to know is that the fact of systemic racism exists. We live in a sea of it. And what I have learned is to be an ally is that I'm gonna make mistakes. I'm going to say something stupid sometimes. I'm not going to recognize the voice of a person with a different lived experience than me. And many of my friends, many people of color will call me out on that. And that's okay. It's good that people will call me out on that. So to me, that's what being an ally means. Speaking out, walking side by side with people of color, not in front of them, side by side. Acknowledging my mistakes, laughing at my mistakes, laughing with people of color as we do the important work to address structural racism. So I'm happy with who I am. This is not so much about I'm not a racist, but rather, what am I doing in my realm, my sphere of influence? What am I doing to combat the fact that there is racism in our world? Next slide, please. What does justice look like in medicine? I'm going to use the word justice a bit. I like that word. I like it a little bit more than equity. because equity has so many meanings, means so many different things. I sort of like the word justice. So what does justice look like to that Asian American gynecologist in the upper left of this photo? What does it look like to her? I know that gynecologist, Dr. Pace there, and she works at my organization, and she has had a different experience in COVID-19 than I have. What does justice look like to her? When COVID started in the nation of China, and then all Asian Americans are lumped together as being somehow responsible. I have no idea what that's like, but she certainly does. What does justice look like to that woman of color and her child of color? What does it look like to her? Very few doctors look like her, very few look like her child. But like any other mother, she wants and deserves a healthcare system in which she belongs. Her child is valued and she's heard as a mother. And what about Dr. Bramo, the woman in the bottom of this picture? She was one of my residents. What does justice look like to a Black woman who is entering a field of medicine? I will tell you that Dr. Bramo in that picture is an intelligent, smart, outgoing, super skilled physician. She's now a fellow in the University of Oklahoma in gastroenterology. But she would tell me, she did tell me, that she was mistaken all the time for the housekeeper, the food service worker, the physical therapist, the nurse, anything other than the doctor. So what does justice look like to her? I would suggest that as an ally, I need to ask them. I need to find out, and then I need to call out microaggressions, call out structures of racism, and be an ally. Next slide, please. But going beyond our healthcare systems, what does justice look like here? I took these pictures. Because George Floyd was murdered about a mile from my home. His body was brought to my hospital in one of our ambulances and was cared for by my colleagues in my hospital. That's our clinic in the upper right, one of our community clinics. That building is destroyed now after the unrest that happened after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officers. 20 to 30 of my colleagues are on the witness list for the trials because that's how close we were involved. So how do we stand with our communities outside our clinical practice? What does justice look like in the world from a healthcare lens? Next slide. Allyship is the first word. The second word is intention. We must act with intention. So ACP has loads of policies on all kinds of issues: gun violence, public health, women in the workforce, abortion and reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus issues. And there's the slide. I encourage you to go to that slide. It's on the ACP online website. We have positions, we have a stance. And as Lin-Manuel Miranda said in Hamilton, if you stand for nothing, what will you fall for? ACP stands for things, but I maintain that without intentionality, nothing will happen. Hand-wringing isn't going to fix it. Sitting in our offices isn't going to fix it. In our practices, in our chapters, in our communities, staying silent won't help. We have to have intention to act. And ACP has the tools to help us act. But if we don't think about it and do it, it ain't gonna happen. Next slide, please. A couple examples of intentional action. When COVID-19 hit, not one of us knew what the heck was going on. I didn't. But here I am, a Minnesota governor, trying to figure out how to make an impact. And sometimes, even if you don't know what to do, you just have to say something and act. So I wrote a letter to this governor of the state of Minnesota, not the ACP governor, the actual governor. This guy named Tim Walz. I wrote to him and said, here's what Minnesota physicians think, and I want to advocate. And then I sent a note to our chapter saying, let's be loud about this health crisis. I told our chapter, we must be vocal advocates. And so I sent a letter to the governor of the state of Minnesota. Next slide, please. And you know what? It worked. The governor of the state of Minnesota got back to us and says, yeah, he got back to us, his office did, within hours. And so it actually, we were heard. I called a state senator that I know from the state of Minnesota, and within 3 hours of me calling him, he was on our Senate floor talking about the public health crisis of COVID-19. If you simply do something, it will work. It's like in hockey. Bob Doherty likes hockey, so do I. Minnesota is the state of hockey, after all. Good things happen when you shoot the puck. Nothing happens if you stay silent. So we got to do something. And it worked in Minnesota. Next slide, please. What about racism? This is where advocacy reached a new intensity, at least in my state. In the lower right, that is the paper which Josh Sershin, Bob Doherty, and our HPPC committee put together in the summer of 2020. I encourage you to look at it. I encourage you to read how your organization is being bold in advocacy about racism. At the state level, you can do something too. I wrote a letter on behalf of our chapter, consistent with ACP policy. I'm not just out there doing anything. This is consistent with policy to the House of Representative, the Speaker of our House. And I said, we wish to support House Resolution 1, which declares racism a public health crisis. She knew that the physician community of internal medicine specialists had her back when the Minnesota House of Representatives voted to make racism a public health crisis. Next slide, please. These are all things we can do. And then in the aftermath of George Floyd, we felt like we had to take bold action in our chapter. So I, with my colleagues, wrote a 2-page statement. It's probably the boldest, most scary thing I've done. I used an approach of AAA, acknowledgement, apology, and action. We acknowledge that structural racism exists. We called it for what it is. Then we apologized for past actions, even though I'm not personally responsible for what happened in 1925, but it is still appropriate to apologize for any role our organization has had in excluding people. And then we had very specific actions in our statement. And people wonder, what is your membership going to think? What's your membership going to think? Are you going to lose members? Oh my goodness. One member of ours in the lower left of the slide said, I want you to know that I really appreciated the strength and clarity of the statement. It goes so far beyond anything I've seen from other healthcare organizations. I've never given to the chapter before, but I did this time. We actually gained members when we made a bold statement. So practically speaking, it works. It's also the right thing to do. Next slide, please. So intentionality matters, just a personal reflection. It is not the work of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It is not their work to fix racism. It is not their work to educate me about racism and about their lives. It is certainly not their work to make me their friend and welcome me into spaces of their safe spaces so that I can feel better because I have a Black friend. It's not their work to do that. None of that is their work. It's my work. It is my work, and I must be intentional to seek out ways to educate myself, to call out things that are inappropriate, to learn, to make mistakes, to laugh at my mistakes, and to humbly do the work of ending racism. That's my work. So that's a personal reflection on being intentional. Next slide, please. So allyship, intentionality. The third word is belonging. We need to work towards a place where everyone belongs. I believe this is the end game. It's the end zone. It's the goal. It's the holy grail. I want to live in a world where everybody belongs and knows they belong and feels they belong, and we are not there. My colleagues and friends from the BIPOC community tell me I don't always feel like I belong. And that's interesting to me because I had to learn that in the last few years. I'm a white guy. I'm a doctor. I'm relatively affluent. I'm straight, Protestant, you name it. I haven't lived in a place where I didn't feel like I belonged. And it is my job to realize that not everybody has that privilege. So what can we do? A couple of examples. In that top picture, that is our congresswoman from Minnesota. Maybe many of you have heard of her. I'm in her district. That's Ilhan Omar. She delivered her babies at my hospital. We have a program at my hospital for Black mothers. They get a gift bag. They get a gift bag with lotions and hair care products when they deliver their babies that are appropriate for Black women. I was clueless about this, but Black women might have different preferences for their personal care products. They got a gift bag that acknowledges that. One little teeny thing to say, you belong here. In the lower right is our Black Men with Stethoscopes event. We had 80 young Black men ages 12 to 18 in our clinic setting where they watched a panel of Black men, physicians in white coats. They got to see cool stuff in our simulation lab. They got to fill a cavity in a dentistry thing. They got to deliver a baby from a mannequin, and they saw it all being led by Black men and women. We have a Black Women with Stethoscopes event that's happened as well. And we've got events planned for Native people, Latinos, and it's a great event. And they were told, they were all asked to speak in unison. I look like a doctor. Most of them had never seen a Black man as a doctor. So this is something we can do, a place where you belong. In the lower left is the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Minnesota. She's a Native woman. We're really working on that community as well. Next slide, please. I took this picture in Washington, and I can't wait to be out there again. My plane leaves in about 20 hours, Bob Doherty, and I will be out there for Leadership Day. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And I'll have to expand on Dr. King's words. Next slide. I'm going to close. Advocacy. Why does this matter? Why does it even matter? Well, I say that being an ally and acting with intention leads to belonging for all people. Being an ally and acting with intention leads to belonging for all people. Next slide, please. This is a plug for me that I want to just talk to you about. I was a radio talk show host for 13 years. Yeah, I do a lot of weird things. But my radio show ended, but I now have a podcast. It's called Healthy Matters. The website is right there. I ask you to listen to it, but listen specifically to episode 8, where I talked to this woman, Dr. Necka Cederstrom, who is a genius. She's one of 4 or 5 or 8 PhDs in clinical ethics, and she's our health equity officer. When I say 4 or 5 Black women nationwide, she is the bomb. She's great. She tells me all the time what I need to know, and I have learned more from this woman than almost anybody. Listen to this episode, if you would, about an essential conversation on race, racism in the healthcare system. It's at healthymatters.org. Next slide, please. I'm going to close. I'm going to say thank you. Again, that's a plug of me doing the podcast because, that's, selfish promotion. But give it a listen if you would. It's been a privilege to talk to you. And again, these are my personal reflections. And I just want to say that it's exciting work. It's challenging work. It's sometimes hard work, but we shouldn't be despondent. We should walk side by side with our BIPOC friends and colleagues. If you're white, and if you are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, thank you for walking side by side with me as we learn how to combat racism. And I really want to live in a world where everybody feels like they belong, not just guys like me, everybody. A world where we all belong. So I look forward to the panelist discussions that's coming up. I look forward to learning and having this conversation with you. Thank you for inviting me, 5 governors and executive directors. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. One of my privileges in ACP has been coming around people like David and everybody else on this event today. It's made my life so much richer and so much better, and I'm eternally grateful for that. We'll move on to our panel discussion. We have 5 panelists. Each one of them would talk for about 8 minutes, would give their views, and then we'll go to question and answers. Our first panelist is Dr. Moro Salifu. He received his MD from Duku Eylül University Medical School in Izmir, Turkey. He completed internal medicine residency at State University of New York Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn, followed by fellowship in nephrology and transplant nephrology at SUNY as well, and then fellowship in interventional nephrology at Emory in Atlanta. He received his MPH from SUNY and an MBA from George Washington University in Washington, DC. He is currently professor and chair of medicine and chief of nephrology at SUNY. He serves as chair of the executive committee for Brooklyn Health Disparities Center in the New York State Region 9. Additionally, Dr. Salifu serves the New York ACP chapter as member of the Council Board and Planning Committee and is chair of the chapter DEI committee. He is going to give us his overview on implicit bias and a call to action. Dr. Salifu, my pleasure. Is Dr. Salifu on? We can't hear him. Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. You're loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Can you see my slides?
Yes, sir. We do see your slides.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Atiq, for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Lynn, for the invitation. I also like to acknowledge my governor, who is in the audience, Dr. Lee from Stony Brook, and all the governors who put this program together. I would like to make the comment that this topic is very dear to my heart. Some of it has already been discussed, so my goal is to get to the very fine details of what it actually means in terms of clinical care and also healthcare quality. So I have a few things to cover here, but I will start with definitions. So it begins with stereotypes, and these are usually perceptions of others formed through life experiences and often are negative. You could say that stereotypes could be positive because somebody has a perception of good things about other people, but in general, stereotypes are actually negative. In other words, people form different opinions in their minds, and they have a picture of something, and they define that something as good or bad, and that stays in the mindset. Now, when it comes out, it becomes implicit bias. In other words, whatever you've stored in your mind because of the life experiences and what you've considered as good or bad in your mind, when that comes out in the form of an attitude towards others based on preformed stereotypes, it becomes implicit bias. In other words, the actions that come out resulting from stereotypes are the biases. And because it's unconscious, you don't know about them, they are called implicit. Of course, if it is explicit or conscious bias, you would know offhand that there's a problem, right? You can say somebody is tall or somebody is short, and that is very obvious. You say it, and that's conscious bias. And sometimes when you do things that are conscious, that violates the law would hold you responsible. But it's impossible to actually have the law be responsible for implicit bias because we don't know what it is. It is just a stereotype that is in your mind that is expressed at some point in your life because of what you think the person is assigned in your brain as good or bad. So therefore, implicit biases are negative attitudes that can affect clinical encounters and therefore can affect quality of care. And that is the crux of this presentation, how implicit bias actually affects the quality of care. And this is how it does it. This is the model from the Institute of Medicine in 2003. It is now renamed as the National Academy of Medicine. But what they did was to try to quantify healthcare quality between non-minority populations and minority populations. There's a difference in healthcare quality. And you can assign the difference into 3 boxes. One is, whether the clinical care is appropriate or not, which is very difficult to really assess because there are also patient preferences in this box. And the other one is the complexity of the healthcare system. And that we know about, and that probably contributes to disparity and also discrimination, which has already been addressed by Dr. Hilden in his talk. This discrimination comes in the forms of biases, stereotypes, and uncertainty in healthcare. Now, in terms of health disparity, the definition really is within the healthcare system and discrimination. That is what really accounts for healthcare disparity, not what patient preferences typically are, even though, patient preference could be due to other reasons, for instance, mistrust of the healthcare system and all the other small little details. But the disparity actually lies within the ecology of the healthcare system and also in discrimination. So I'm going to give you some few clinical examples. minority, and I'm using this, terminology broadly to mean, age, gender, race, sex, anything that has to do with differences between people's characteristics. All these clinical areas, there have been implicit biases associated with them. But I'm going to give you just two examples to illustrate how it's actually in action. So this is an example. This is the effect of race and sex on physicians' recommendations for cardiac cath. This was done in 2000 or 1999. Very interesting experiment. 4 women, 2 black, 2 whites. 4 men, 2 black, 2 whites. And they videotaped these patients. They were, trained to behave as if they had chest pain, presented to the emergency room. Then in 2 national meetings, they interviewed, they played the video to 720 physicians and told them to make a decision on what needs to be done for these patients, right? And these are the results. Blacks and women in general were less likely to be referred for cardiac cath, and Black women were less likely to be referred the most. Just looking at the video and deciding what, the care of these patients should look like, the implicit bias was in action. So this is implicit bias in action. This is another example. This came out, about 2 years ago, and it was captured in CNN. That's why I'm showing CNN, clip here. It said Black newborns more likely to die when looked after by white doctors. This was a very large study. 1.8 million babies were studied, and the results show that Black women, Black newborn babies in the US are more likely to survive childbirth if they are cared for by Black doctors, but 3 times more likely than white babies to die when looked after by white doctors. So again, this is implicit bias in action. So the question is why? Why? Because I don't think that there is a problem with the doctor. The doctor doesn't, deliver the baby or refer the patient to the cardiac cath with the intention of harming this baby. I don't think that is the case. There is no way I would believe that the doctor who took care of these patients and is white actually intended for the baby's outcome to be negative. But what is in the mindset may have affected what choices were made for these babies, right? That is the implicit bias that we are trying to define and trying to see how appropriate culturally we can design care to match these populations, age, gender, race, to make sure that we don't have implicit biases. So there is a historical context which has already been discussed. I just wanted to outline some of the very major legislations. Some of them, were more than 100 years that actually created segregation and discrimination. They were more negative in the beginning. These are like federal laws or, state laws that created really bad problems in terms of creating these stereotypes in people. This is another example of the redlining in 1929 housing crisis that really led to segregation of communities that is now permanent in American society. These red zones couldn't get mortgages, student loans, credit cards, insurances, and that became permanent for more than 100 years. So there's another area here, the mistrust issues. This is the great Dr. Marion Sims in 1846, who tried to do surgery in African-American women because he thought, without anesthesia, because he thought that they didn't feel much pain. This is also the Tuskegee syphilis study that also brought in a lot of mistrust in the medical system. Henrietta Lacks immoral cell lines also created the same mistrust system within the healthcare system. So all these issues create, stereotypes. These issues lead to stereotypes, and that is what causes the implicit biases. So if you put it into context, this is what happens. You have delayed wealth accumulation in this minority population, especially in the African-American population, because the history is much, much more robust and documented in that population than the others. So I'm using that as an example. And then there is this persistently segregated and poor neighborhoods, right? So that leads to others thinking about, who are you and what do you do and all that stuff. So that leads to bias and stereotype issues, mistrust issues. That leads to a huge psychosocial trauma, poor social determinants of health, and high risk of comorbidities in these communities. And that is then how people actually see each other, as good or bad in terms of perceptions. So what do we do? For the doctors, we have to, or the medical community, we have to really make sure that implicit bias is very much known. Awareness is very important. There are actually some training programs that can, and healthcare systems can actually make sure they are, providers can actually know about this issue and begin to address them. Cultural competency or awareness or sensitivities are also part of these training programs. Patient education and empowerment is very important. We have to really promote consistency and equity of care through use of evidence-based guidelines. If we go with what the literature says to take care of patients, we're likely not to go wrong, right? But if we go, by what we think of what the person may have, we're likely to go wrong. Support the use of interpretation services. Not everyone is linguistically competent, and we have to provide those resources to make sure that we're reaching out to everyone in the healthcare setting. We can increase proportion of underrepresented minorities. This is what our Brooklyn Health Disparity is actually spending a lot of the federal money doing. We are training a lot of pipeline students from high school to college students and junior faculty members and postdocs to be able to get into the health sciences and be able to participate in this discussion. For patients, I think they have to be aware of potential for implicit bias and be trained when the opportunity arises through brochures and all those things. We have to make improvements in the following areas. Health literacy is very important. Health information is very important. How we actually craft information to be able to be consumed by patients in a way that they can actually understand 8th grade language. You go to a doctor's office, you see brochures, you have to be a PhD sometimes to understand what they're saying. And we expect patients to actually, who are not literate, to be able to get that information and digest the information. And we have to provide enough health services and advocacy, like what Dr. Hilden has already mentioned. Advocacy is so important in making sure that all these issues are addressed. So in the 8 minutes that I had, I didn't think I could go more than this. This topic is so broad, but the summary of it all is that implicit bias negatively impacts healthcare quality. Therefore, it's not possible to attain a high quality health system without addressing implicit bias and health inequities. They are really intertwined. You cannot get the quality without the equity, and you cannot get the equity without the implicit bias issues addressed. So I hope that I've been able to change your minds on how to think about this, and hopefully we can have more discussions at the end.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Salifu. This has been a wonderful talk. It just reminds me, the implicit bias that we have reminds me of a quote from somebody who lived close to where Dr. Salifu went to medical school, Rumi, who said, your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. And I think that is a way of looking at implicit bias. We don't need to look, we need to look for the barriers. We need to look for that implicit bias. But thank you so much. This was so wonderful. We're going to move on and go to Dr. Kelsi Manley. She received her MD from University of Arizona College of Medicine in Phoenix. She completed internal medicine residency as a chief here at Oregon Health and Sciences University in Portland, Oregon. She's assistant professor of medicine, Division of Hospital Medicine at Oregon Health and Sciences University. And she serves the Oregon ACP chapter as the chair of annual advocacy day and served on the ACP National Advocacy Curriculum Work Group. She is going to talk about listening to communities, integration of DEI in multiple spheres, advocating for and with different groups, interprofessional patients, communities. Dr. Manley?
Thank you so much, Dr. Atiq, and thank you all so much for giving me the space to talk to you all today. There are some heavy hitters on this panel. People who are really shaping the future of healthcare, and I feel a little intimidated, to be honest with you, but I'm trying to be present and lean into that discomfort a little bit and just enjoy this opportunity to talk to you all today. So thank you for giving me the space. The theme of today's messaging is about influencing change in medicine. And in the spirit of that, I wanted to share with you all a story about the first time that I felt I was able to influence change on behalf of a group of people who were left behind. And I'm not just sharing this story to toot my own horn or because I like talking about it so much, but I think that story helps me kind of demonstrate the lessons I learned through that. And I think they can be relevant for us as physicians trying to make sense of and impact a system that is frankly not working. When I was about 20 years old, I advocated in front of my legislator for the very first time. I was a young college student living in Duluth, Minnesota. There's a couple of us Minnesotans out here today, and attended a small Catholic liberal arts school there. And the representative for my district at the time was a Catholic nun. Around 2012, you might remember, there was a bunch of legislation sweeping through the nation to either ban or legalize same-sex marriage on a state level. And I was approached as this young, gay, newly out, previously very closeted and not necessarily accepted member of my Catholic community by this advocacy organization called Minnesota United. And at the time, Minnesota was seeking to legalize same-sex marriage in our state. And my representative, the Catholic nun, was leaning against voting in favor of this legislation. So these organizers, they came to me and they said, hey, we asked around your campus and you're like all we got. You know, you're the only person who's out. You're the only person we can think of who could go talk to your representative. Would you be interested to go there and speak with her and try to change her mind? And, you know, I was nervous at the time, more nervous than I even am today. And I was unsure how to respond, but I agreed only if A, they would tell me what they meant by the term representative. I was not sure what was going on in my government at all at that time in my life. And B, if they'd give me some gas money because I couldn't afford to drive all the way down to St. Paul. So they coached me up. They met both of my needs. They actually gave me a ride, and I found myself in a room across from my representative and able to share my story. And I don't remember what I said at all, actually. I don't remember any of the words that I said to her. I remembered feeling really nervous. I remember that my voice was shaking. I didn't feel like an expert on the topic at all, but all I had was my lived experience to share with somebody who had the power to make a decision that would directly impact me. And I was pretty surprised when a couple of months later, I received a call from her office asking me to join some people in the Minnesota House chambers for the day of the vote. And I watched her as she switched her vote and voted in favor of the legislation. And that was, I get emotional every time I talk about it, because it was, you know, one of the biggest moments in my life. I felt like I made an actual difference in the lives of people like me. And she paved the way, right, with that vote for legalized marriage equality and being seen as equal for thousands of people like me. I learned a couple lessons from that experience that I take with me today. And I think about them a lot when I advocate on behalf of my patients and our profession. The first lesson, number one, is that our stories, the stories of the patients and the communities we serve, are incredibly powerful. Like I said, I was not an expert in marriage policy or statistics thereof, but I had a story to tell. And as physicians, you know, we're given the privilege of hearing the full breadth of the human condition by the nature of our jobs. We're given access into some of the most gut-wrenching rooms with some of the strongest and most resilient human beings in our patients. And we know more than anyone who is making our laws right now or creating our systems, what it feels like to sit across from someone who is sick because of a system that has not been designed to serve them. Those stories deserve to be brought to life. For example, in Oregon in 2020, there was legislation being drafted and considered around drug decriminalization in our state, namely as a way to prevent the harms that our communities, and disproportionately our Black communities in Oregon, were suffering in the name of the war on drugs. And I was an early advocate in this movement and in this space, and I knew that I wanted to pitch this to well-respected, sturdy institutions that have power in our legislature, like ACP. So I did my research. I knew my facts. I was committed to evidence and reason, as we are as physicians. But I started every conversation with every stakeholder in every room with the story of a real human being who has suffered unthinkable harms as a result of the incarceration practices going on in our state at the time. And I know that that story, more than any stat I threw their way, stuck with the people that I tried to convince of this legislation. And we have to amplify the voices of the people who this legislation and this system really affects. As an aside, that legislation, tribulations and challenges and all, is currently the law of the land in Oregon now, with a firm Oregon ACP endorsement, and something we're very proud of, I think, in our state. That brings me to the second lesson I want to share with you from my story in Minnesota, and that's that when given opportunities and resources, like I was given in 2012, gas money, coaching, sponsorship, a seat at the table, people with even limited agency, like I had at the time, can be agents for remarkable change. So I ask the people in this room today, think of the work you're doing to create change right now. Who's at the table with you? Who are you bringing along for the ride? Is there a way to sponsor a young student or somebody, an interested patient, somebody who's directly impacted by these policies? Can you give them a seat at the table? That advocacy group took a chance on bringing me along for the ride. And here I am, 10 years later, still doing this work. And I don't know that I would be if I wouldn't have had that experience in my formative years. So think about who you're bringing along for this ride. Advocacy work is so wonderful, and it shouldn't be siloed. It shouldn't be siloed from the people who it really affects. During our annual Oregon ACP Advocacy Day, for which I'm the chair, we really try to bring this idea to life as well. We focus on first-time advocates. We get students in from across disciplines, nursing students, physicians, and we try to build confidence and grant access to these spaces that people are often kind of kicked out of. You gotta start somewhere, right? So bring people along for the ride. And I think that was a lesson that really stuck with me. So to wrap up here, I just want to bring you back to that day in 2012. Come back there with me for a second, when I was sitting in the Minnesota chambers and waiting to hear the fate of my rights in the state I call home. And all of a sudden, I heard this roar of voices outside the chamber from everybody who was not invited inside, like the one that like I had been so lucky to have been brought inside. And this roar was so loud, they had to actually pause the vote. And everyone inside who had been granted access became silent. And we listened to the people outside. And you could hear this unified chorus of voices so loud, all singing, all we are saying is give love a chance. It's a take on the Beatles, song, Give Peace a Chance, that was sang in the 60s and 70s during the civil rights movement. And it made us all be quiet and listen to the people who were not in that space. So if nothing else from the last 8 minutes that I've had here with you today, I hope that visual and that thought of a chorus of voices will stick with you in some way, the way it's stuck with me. We as clinicians and healers can be a chorus of voices if we work together this way. And we can be a very powerful force if we remember to include everyone's voices when we sing that tune, especially those who are often left outside the room. It's very hard to ignore a chorus of voices like that. And our decision makers have to listen when we let ourselves get a little bit loud. So I'll leave you with that today. And Dr. Atiq, thank you so much for moderating us. And thank you all for the opportunity to speak.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Manley. I could almost cry with joy and pride. Such powerful and inspiring words. Thank you for doing what you're doing and what you have done. So grateful. ACP and our medicine is so much better because of people like you. Thank you, and continue doing that. We looking forward to many, many more events and changes that you and others like you would bring to our healthcare system and to our country. Well, moving on, I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Cynthia Jumper, who received her MD from Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center in Lubbock, Texas. She completed her internal medicine residency at the same center, followed by a fellowship in pulmonary critical care at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. She received her MPH from University of Texas Health Sciences Center of Public Health in Houston, Texas. Dr. Jumper is a professor of medicine at Texas Tech, where she's also serving as Vice President of Governmental Relations and Managed Care. Additionally, she's president of the Texas ACP chapter. She is going to move things along, advocating for an issue, how to move things through professional societies, organizations, institutions, and communities. Dr. Jumper, it's all yours.
Hello from the state of Texas. You're probably surprised we have any advocacy for health in the state of Texas by watching the news, but we do. And being a lifelong educator, I first want to tell you the lessons I want to get across before I tell you the story. And following Dr. Manley, I don't think I will do quite as well as she did. You're an inspiration to all of us. But when Roger Keaton asked me to give this talk, at first I said, I don't think so. I said, it's not my area of expertise. You know, ask me about ventilator management, ask me about pulmonary physiology, and I'm your girl. But to talk about this, I wasn't as comfortable. And I went to talk to my vice president of diversity, who is a transgender woman. And about the time she got her hands from around my throat, when I told her I wasn't for sure I wanted to do this, she said, if not you, then who? She said, I can't be on every talk. I can't be on every committee. I can't do this. We can't do this by ourselves without our allies. You've heard a lot about an ally, so I won't go into that, but it's very important. If us allies don't scoot over and give people seats at the table, we'll never get there. One of the books I always enjoyed reading was Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. And when you got to someplace in her book, she said, after you read this, go and buy 10 more copies and give it to your male friends. And I did that. And then I called and made sure my male friends read it, because they had to scoot over to give me a seat at that table. I think somebody said, if there's not room at the table, bring a folding chair. Well, that was me. I got into this. So then I told Roger, okay, I'll do it. Well, I'm fortunate to be at a university that's got a law school, and our law school just won a national advocacy award of something. So I went to talk to my attorney friends about advocacy. And they gave me some important things. They said, make sure in advocacy that you know your audience. And they gave the example that one of them had actually argued the case at the Supreme Court. They knew 4 were going to vote yes, and they knew that 4 were going to vote no. So their whole audience was that one swing vote. And they had to tailor their entire message to that one person. So if you're there preaching to the choir, you're not needed. If you're there preaching to the group that's never going to change their mind, it's not needed. So know your audience. And when you know your audience, you're going to know which phrases will get you shut down quickly. In Texas, I can't say critical race theory if I want to talk about anything, but I can talk about history. I can talk about what happened. I don't have to use that catchphrase. I can still get my message across without using that term. I pretty much can't say structural racism or, my governor on down. And I don't mean my governor of the ACP. I mean, my governor, they'll come down and, and chastise me. In Texas, we can't say expand Medicaid, but I can talk all day about a grant from the federal government to expand access to our care. So when you're working with advocacy, know your audience and be very concise and very focused. When we're talking about your voice, it's through your resolutions. And that's really what my topic is in the last 4 minutes, is your voice is the resolutions that you write. So the tale I'm going to tell a little bit is about the Texas Medical Association, which I'm going to call the TMA, and then the American Medical Association, the AMA. They both in the past few years have come out with a very good product on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now in Texas, we got tired of saying that, so we threw justice in there, and then we rearranged the letter. So now we have JEDI, Justice, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and we're called the JEDI Committee, the JEDI Group. But all of the work at both of these organizations came from a resolution that somebody like you wrote, and it got passed to the House of Delegates. And in Texas, the House, when they voted on these, they voted to refer them to the Board of Trustees, which I sit on for the TMA. And the Board of Trustees didn't know where to send which council to send some of these resolutions. So they created this JEDI committee. And I was the liaison from the Board of Trustees on the JEDI committee. And we took those and we had an incredible committee. Dr. Bornstein was on it with me. And we did it with the knowledge about how the AMA did it. So the AMA also had a resolution. It got passed. It went to their Board of Trustees. Their Board of Trustees also had a committee. It went back to the Board of Trustees, and then it got acted on. When it got acted on without as much going through the House of Delegates, there was a huge pushback from the House of Delegates. And those of us that were at those meetings, it was ugly. Words racism were thrown around. Words such as, honey, you need to calm down, got pushed out from people. It was not very pretty. And we sat through that. So when the TMA, when in Texas we decided to do it, we learned our lesson. So we put together over 3 or 4 months, I think it's about a 7-page document. And we avoided those words that would shut down half of our group, right? But we still got everything in there. We knew our audience and we knew what other people had done. And so we put together a document and then we ran the whole thing back to the House of Delegates. Every council got to see it. The House of Delegates got to see it. They got to see it early enough that it wasn't a surprise on the floor, and we got it approved. Only one person stood up to speak against it. And that person said what our previous speaker said, I'm not a racist. That's what people like to say. I'm not a racist. But the TMA had a policy that Black physicians were not allowed to be a member of the TMA way back when. So it's hard to explain, as the previous speaker said, that's not the question. It's not whether you're a racist, but when we have a systemic, so we call it systemic racism because I can't say structural racism here because my state doesn't like it. So we say systemic. When we have systemic policies in place that have set people back, then we need to correct those. So that is kind of the tell how two people, both end products guys were great, but at the TMA, we really worked through our House of Delegates. We got it out. We had a lot of people looking at it. The AMA, they went a little bit more through their board of trustees and then just gave us the final project. And then that's where that pushback came. So my lessons are, if not you, then who? Every one of y'all need to be involved in this, including me. Know your audience, make sure that your message is very concise. Make sure your voice is heard through your resolution. And I've got 45 more seconds, so I'm watching my clock, I promise. The resolutions are so important because that is what drives these professional organizations. It's not the board of trustees. As great as Dr. Bornstein is, it's not her, saying, hey, we need to do this. It is y'all. It is everybody there that's putting together what we think that we need to practice in our towns. And then it's going and getting all the buy-in. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm impressed with everybody, and I'll be here for questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jumper. Such pearls of wisdom and pragmatic solutions and pragmatic ways to achieve our goals. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Next, I'm going to ask Dr. Susan Hingle to talk. She received her MD from Rush Medical College in Chicago, Illinois, did her internal medicine residency and the chief here at Georgetown University Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Hingle is a professor of medicine and associate dean for human and organizational potential and director of faculty development at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine in Springfield, Illinois. Additionally, she is the chair emeritus of ACP Board of Regents, past governor of ACP's Illinois Downstate chapter, and she currently serves as the ACP as well-being and professional fulfillment committee on the professional fulfillment committee. She serves the Illinois ACP chapter on planning committee as member of the council board. She is going to continue the talk on advocating for an issue, how to move things through professional societies, organizations, institutions, and communities. Dr. Hingle.
Thank you, Dr. Atiq. And I first just wanted to start out, I know Dr. Manley, when you started your remarks, you said that you were intimidated. There's absolutely no reason for you to be intimidated. You were inspiring, and I am very proud to have you in the ACP and working on these important initiatives. And I can tell you, after hearing you speak, my imposter fairy has shown up. Whenever my imposter fairy shows up, if you ever see me do this in a talk, I'm flicking the imposter fairy off my shoulder. So after following you and Dr. Jumper, I'm flicking her off my shoulder right now. As Dr. Atiq mentioned, I'm going to continue the discussion on how to move things through professional societies, organizations, institutions, and committees. And I decided to focus on the ACP. I really do appreciate the opportunity to reflect on some of the successes and the impact of the grassroots work of the ACP, which I feel is the most important part of the ACP. The ACP is its members, and this is how members' voices are heard. So I'm hoping that through the reflection on some of the incredible successes the grassroots has brought to the college, it will inspire you all to keep those roots growing. So I'm going to ask for the next slide, please. So I'm decided to take a step back and talk about the resolutions process as one way forward. Some of you may be very familiar with the resolutions process, but on the chance that we have people who are not familiar with the resolutions process, I wanted to highlight this because this is where I'm going to talk about 3 initiatives that really became part of the fabric of the college started. So the resolutions process was started in 1985, and the whole purpose of the resolutions process was to develop a mechanism for ACP members to have their voices heard and for their voices to be able to develop and go all the way up to the Board of Regents, which is the policy-making body of the college. So it really is an opportunity for the grassroots voices of the ACP to be heard. Important to know that a resolution is something that asks the ACP to take a position or an action. If your resolution doesn't do that, it's unlikely to be successful. It's also important to know that any ACP member can submit a resolution, and we'll talk a little bit about the process by which someone can do that. And resolutions can also be initiated by a committee or a council. So next slide. So these are, again, taking that big step back, the 6 phases of the resolution process. The first is a very detailed process that happens before the Board of Governors meeting. And those detailed steps can be found on LeaderNet. But basically, a member will work with a chapter to develop the resolution and to submit the resolution. A lot of people don't know what happens with it after that. So again, for those of you who have not been involved in a resolutions process, thought that it might be beneficial to quickly go through this. Those resolutions are then presented at the Board of Governors meeting. There is a reference committee that is convened, and that reference committee listens to all of the testimony on the resolutions. They then make recommendations as to adopt, not adopt, adopt with an amendment, or to refer for study. That report is then presented to the Board of Governors and discussed further. And then the Board of Governors, each Board of Governors member has the opportunity to vote on each resolution. After that happens, those are then reviewed by an additional committee called the Resolutions Review Committee that then turns that into a report that is presented to the Board of Regents by the chair of the Board of Governors. And at that Board of Regents meeting, the regents then review all of those resolutions, they discuss, and they vote. And that's how policy happens. Each of the items that is adopted or referred is then triaged onto the appropriate committee, council, or staff. And then the loop is closed when there is a report that's sent back to the Board of Governors regarding what happened with each of those resolutions. So that's the sort of the quick and dirty of the resolutions process, which again is a really impactful way to really influence healthcare, education, and the profession as a whole. Next slide, please. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to have reflected on the resolutions process. And there were 3 that really came out in my mind as 3 that were really, really impactful. And we'll talk a little bit about those because I feel like we can learn so much from history and experience. So we're going to talk about the High Value Care Initiative, Wellbeing and Professional Fulfillment Initiative, as well as gender equity and equity, diversity, and inclusion broadly. Next slide. So in 2011, there was a resolution put forth through a chapter, and the sponsoring chapter at that time was Colorado. And you can see the details of this. This really was a resolution that was put forth to encourage the college to help members learn about the efficacy and impact of common clinical practices. And you can see in this, the resolved was very specific. It asked for a group of experts to apply data from the medical literature and generate quarterly message to ACP members about the impact of some common clinical practices. This resolution did not pass, interestingly. The discussion at the Board of Governors meeting regarding this was incredibly robust and very impactful. And what this resolution, even though it was not adopted, led to was the ACP's High Value Care Initiative, which all of you probably are very familiar with. It is an initiative that has greatly impacted medical education. It has greatly impacted the clinical care that we provide to patients. And so I think one of the things that gets frustrating for members is when they submit a resolution and it's not adopted, they feel like it is a failure. In this case, this resolution was not adopted, and it was an incredible success and led to some very, very important foundational work and meaningful work for the college. Next slide. In 2016, there was another very successful resolution. And I picked this one because it's something that's near and dear to my heart, but also because it was sponsored by the Council of Early Career Physicians. I feel like sometimes people who are early in their careers feel like their voices are not important. And it is the exact opposite of that. As the future of the profession of medicine, your voices are incredibly important and impactful. And that was demonstrated in this resolution from the Council of Early Career Physicians that asked for the ACP to develop an infrastructure to support expansion and sustainability of wellness initiatives for physicians and physicians in training, and that the ACP become a leading voice in addressing these areas. And this led to some incredibly important work. The sustainable infrastructure that was created was an innovative well-being champions program. Some of you may be some of those well-being champions. It led to a well-being committee. It led to integration. This, I think, was one of the most important things in how this resolution was worded. It wanted to develop infrastructure to support expansion and sustainability. And this work led to integration of well-being into the ACP's goals and into the ACP's core values. The ACP was asked to become a leading voice and has a seat at the table in many, many important areas, including the National Academy of Medicine and a 10-organization collaborative called WELL. And this is all because of this resolution from the Council of Early Career Physicians. Next slide. And then the third that I wanted to talk about was also in 2016. And this resolution, I think, was very foundational in what today is about and what everyone else has been talking about. And it started out very, very focused. The Council of Resident and Fellow members asked the ACP to address the gender pay gap within the field of medicine. And as the ACP dug into this resolution, which was adopted, it ended up realizing that it wasn't just the pay gap. It was about compensation and career advancement. And so there was very detailed policy that came out regarding the gender pay gap that was related to compensation and career advancement. It also led to an additional resolution from the Florida chapter, which looked at compensation and career advancement for people from other marginalized and excluded communities. And this really, really started some foundational efforts related to integration of equity, diversity, and inclusion into all of the work of the ACP, including its goals and core values. And so to me, this resolution shows, and I think some of the other ones, how a little spark can lead to really a wildfire, huge, huge impact. So next slide. So a couple of important lessons Grassroots concerns drive important work of the college. Your voices are incredibly important, and I hope that you all recognize how important your voices are. Work with the ACP staff and leadership as you draft your resolutions so that you can turn something that may be very focused into something that really becomes a much larger initiative. So along those lines, think both small, focused, as well as big and broad at the same time. And next slide, which I believe is my last slide. I think it's easy to get discouraged, frustrated, and to want to disengage. However, I think it's important to recognize that it's one of my favorite quotes by Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And again, I hope these 3 examples demonstrated that to you. Number 2, when you do nothing, you feel overwhelmed and powerless. And that's the worst thing that you can do, because then nothing changes. But when you get involved, you feel a sense of hope and accomplishment that comes from knowing you are working to make things better. A phenomenal quote by Maya Angelou. And I am hoping that these examples, as well as the inspiration shared by Dr. Manley and Dr. Jumper, have restored some hope and inspired you to become an active participant and advocate, because I truly believe that together we can make the profession better for our patients, for our learners, and for each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hingle. You have brought the ACP process of making ideas reality in such a succinct and remarkable manner, and examples of how even an apparent defeat, is really, that's not a word I want to use, can really become a success. So it's not really what happens immediately, but what happens in the long term, and you mentioned that. Thank you so much. With your leadership, we're all better off. Thank you for this beautiful talk. Now we'll move on to Dr. Daniel Anderson. Dr. Anderson received his MD from University of Arkansas School of Medicine in Little Rock, Arkansas. He completed his internal medicine residency, followed by a fellowship in gastroenterology in the Naval Regional Medical Center in San Diego, California. Dr. Anderson is a retired physician from South California Permanente Medical Group and serves as a volunteer clinical professor of medicine at the University of California in San Diego. He's also the chair of the California Colorectal Cancer Coalition and serves the California Region 3 ACP chapter on the Governor's Council. He is going to continue with this thought process of advocating on local, state, and national levels and building successful coalitions. Dr. Anderson?
All right, thank you very much, the Planning Committee, for inviting me to speak on this topic. As mentioned, I'm a member of Dr. Tammy Lynn's California Region 3, and I participated in the ACP Governor's Lobby Day for the past 17 years. I have a special interest in colorectal cancer. Next slide, please. I'll be discussing a policy issue that required 6 years to solve and required numerous partners like ACP. In 2016, a medical director of one of San Diego's federally qualified health centers asked for my help in making colorectal cancer screening part of California's Medicaid managed care quality measures so that his insured patients, most of whom were covered by the California Medicaid insurance, could increase their colorectal cancer screening rate. California's Medicaid insures about 1/3 of all California's insured population, so it's a massive program. We knew that when insurance companies we knew that when insurance companies were required to report colorectal cancer screening, they would become partners in helping clinics increase their screening rates. We'd seen that happen with Kaiser Permanente when Kaiser Health Plan was required to report colorectal cancer screening in its Medicare and commercially insured patients. We were able rapidly to increase our colorectal cancer screening to 80% and achieve the Medicare 5-star rating. Most of his federally qualified patients were insured by Medicaid, and he wanted the insurance companies covering his patients to be involved in increasing his clinic's screening rate. We found out that California's Medicaid Managed Care Division had considered but rejected colorectal cancer screening as a quality measure in 2016, just when he brought this up. This division did have an advisory group, and so we recruited the American Cancer Society, the California Dialogue on Cancer, and we all joined the advisory group that met 4 times a year. Of interest, most of these governmental advisory groups, anyone can join. They wanted public input. By 2019, we had navigated the system and colorectal cancer screening was nominated for addition to their quality measures. But we had a new governor, Governor Newsom, and he wanted to use the national CMS Medicaid adult set of quality measures. Of course, colorectal cancer screening was not on this CMS quality set. It had been considered and rejected in 2019. Next slide. We really needed colorectal cancer screening measured in the Medicaid population. When last measured, it was only 19%. Our federally qualified health centers needed help in raising their screening rates, which were only 46%, much lower than California's other screening rates. And the only disparity in California's colorectal cancer percent of late stage diagnosis, a good surrogate for screening rates, was due to insurance status and also probably economic status. Having Medicaid insurance was like having no insurance at all as far as colorectal cancer screening was concerned. Next slide. As you can see, this large difference in late stage diagnosis was not seen in groups defined by race, age, or sex. So I think it's important when you're talking about disparities to make sure you have a good measure to find out where the disparity was. We were surprised that our main disparity had to do with insurance status and having no insurance at all. So we then found out that CMS Medicaid, next slide, I'm sorry. We then found out that CMS Medicaid used a consulting firm to obtain recommendations for additions and removals of quality measures to its adult quality core set of measures. Mathematica, in a way unknown, selects 29 voting members from all over the United States to meet 5 times annually to propose new quality measures to CMS and propose removal of quality measures. We had to get one of the 29 voting members of this work group to propose colorectal cancer screening. They are listed on the Mathematica website, but no contact information was given. We knew that in the fall of 2020, we had to contact one of the work group members and convince them to nominate colorectal cancer screening as a new measure. Next slide. So in late 2020, we were able to contact the members of this voting group. We were to set up a meeting with 2 of them. One meeting was arranged by one of our partners, the National Colorectal Cancer Roundtable. The other by Levitt Partners. We were involved in a grant who was helping in this effort. And they were able to obtain a meeting with another person of this voting group. We proposed the addition of colorectal cancer screening to these members. And as you can see on this slide, one was Amy Mullins from the American Academy of Family Physicians, and the other was Teresa Elliott from the Joint Commission. We contacted Lynette Scott, who was with our California Department of Public Health, but as many on this call know, actually contacting people in your Department of Public Health is difficult, so we were able to get to her through other people. She also presented it. So we were able to contact them and set up a meeting with them. We were surprised. Most of them didn't know that it wasn't a measure. And so we proposed addition. They accepted it, but they agreed to propose it only if we filled out the 17-page nomination form, which we did. The nomination was accepted to be voted on in May of 2021. Meetings considering measure for additions of measures in 2022. Public comment on all policy is always welcome. One just has to determine how to submit the public comments. In this process, written support comments were not allowed. And I checked on that, and for sure it was not allowed. we had to line up supporters to be with us on the 6-hour-long May 2021 call when this measure would be considered. Next slide. As you can see, we were able to line up these folks who called in and spoke in support of colorectal cancer screening being added. Nope, back slide. And as you can see, it's some people from C4, but people from all over the country. And we were able to raise this coalition through our partners, the National Colorectal Cancer Roundtable, the ACP, and others. And so all of these people called in, the voting group voted, and colorectal cancer screening was recommended for addition by unanimous vote, which is unusual for this group. So next slide. We lined up a large number of supporters that would send written support letters when the draft from Mathematica was sent to CMS. And we, of course, supplied them with draft support letters. And so all of these folks sent in support letters. Go back one slide, please. And so all of these people, as you can see, we lined up quite a coalition to speak in support of CMS accepting this recommendation. And so next slide. CMS did accept the recommendation. CMS Medicaid core quality measure set now contains colorectal cancer screening. And it's also in California Medi-Cal, which is our Medicaid quality measure. And it's receiving special attention this year as a disparity measure in 2022. And it will become one of HEDIS's quality measures in 2022. And this effort required many partners over several years. And that's a lesson I learned. And the other lesson I learned was that in disparities, you have to use some sort of objective measurement to see where the disparity was. We have been working on the disparity in screening in some of our ethnic groups in the past, and we had done a fairly good job. So our disparity, when we looked at this, was economic. It was having the Medicaid insurance or being uninsured. So those were the important things. We used, when we wrote those proposals, we were able to turn that into an article, which I've given the link on this slide that you see here. So next slide. I want to thank ACP for letting me present this story, and I hope the story resonates with you, that it sometimes takes years and you have to line up a whole lot of people. Then when working with the government, public support is always welcome, and you just make sure you can give a venue to give the public support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. You know, persistence, patience, legwork, hard work, wherever you want to make a difference, that is required. And this is such a powerful story about that. Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. As you can all imagine, we are running a little late. We are going to give time for questions and answers. We certainly appreciate your patience. Those who have to leave, we understand that. Thank you so much for joining in. The others can stay around and for the next few minutes to listen to the questions and answers, and then we'll conclude this meeting. Thank you so much. All right, let's see. Are there any questions? Well, I am not seeing any questions. The keynote speaker and the panelists have done such a marvelous job. Tammy, am I missing anything?
No, there aren't any questions. We really appreciate everybody's engagement, and you've done a great job. Thank you so much.
Wow. So this has been a phenomenal discussion, pertinent, relevant, and exceptionally helpful. Please join me in a big round of applause for the creators and organizers of this event, under the leadership of Dr. Tammy Lynn, the speaker, the panelists, and all the participants. But this was a truly insightful and inspiring morning. I'm grateful to be included. From here, we march on.